Holger Lyre. How do you Holger? Rather.
Yeah. How do I pronounce my name? It's actually hard. Holger Lyre.
Lyre.
Yeah, I know it's a strange name even for Germans. I mean, also my fellow countrymen would pronounce it differently. But anyway, I can live with that. Holger Lyre.
Holger Lyre, professor of theoretical philosophy and member of the Center for Behavioral Brain Sciences at the University of Magdeburg. His research areas comprise philosophy of science, neural philosophy, philosophy of AI, and philosophy of physics. His publications include 4 co-authored and 4 co-edited books, as well as about 100 papers. He's worked on foundations of quantum theory and gauge symmetries and made contributions to structural realism, semantic externalism, extended mind, reductionism, and structural models of the mind. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about understanding AI, semantic grounding in large language models, which means it's the theme of the entire summer school. Go ahead, Holger. Welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the nice introduction. Thanks for having me, and thanks again for this extraordinary lineup of speakers and these extraordinary 2 weeks. I suppose that you will also be kind of glad when this is over, because I'll suppose that this is hard work. It's fun on the one hand side, but it must be hard work on the
I'll get a chance to rest a little bit.
Yeah. I can totally understand that. Great. Oh, Ellie is just logging in, so maybe I should wait a few seconds. There she is.
Here. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, so my talk is on understanding AI, in quotes, semantic grounding in large language models. Here we go. I want to talk about, so it's 2 main things. In the first part, I talk about what I call the generative term. Want to motivate this a bit. And then, of course, the core topic is on semantic grounding, and I will split this topic into halves, talk about methodology on the one hand side, and then part 5, section 5 will be the main section where I make the proposal of a tripartite way of thinking about semantic grounding. Actually, semantic grounding in general, not only in LLMs, but in any beings or systems that are capable to produce language. All right, let's just jump in. I may start perhaps with a quote that I found remarkable. It's from last year. I found it in the German newspaper, the Zeit. Actually, this is my translation from the German translation of a quote from Henry Kissinger. I didn't find the original in English, so this is my translation of the late Henry Kissinger, who passed away just after his 100th birthday last year. And so this was an interview in advance of this 100th birthday. And we see Kissinger saying the following thing: today, we no longer know what the machines know. We don't really know why they can speak to us in fluent language. In other words, we have access to a new mystery. And I found this so remarkable, to have a 100-year-old who's not an expert in AI or something, but being still interested in progress, being interested in what's going on in the world, and obviously thinking that what goes on in AI is of utmost importance. And of course, he had written a book 2 years before that, together with Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, and Daniel Hattenlocher, The Age of AI and the Human Future. So Kissinger was really worried, unlike others. And I think that's remarkable, because I think that Kissinger is, of course, totally right. It's an absolutely stunning fact that we have now finally entered the era of talking machines. Of course, we in this group, in this audience, are speculating and reasoning about this the whole time, but we should not forget how extraordinary this development is. And I think that it's quite worrying. It actually worries me that large sections of the public and politicians, in particular politicians, don't look at it this way. I mean, for me, this might perhaps be a technological revolution on the scale of whatever, the development of printing press or the invention of the steam engine. And people just look at it as just normal technological progress. And there's another quote that I found remarkable in this respect by Geoffrey Hinton, who in many interviews from last year said things like the following: "It's as if aliens have landed on Earth, but people don't realize because they speak so fluent English." Yes, we sort of overlook the revolution that is going on. So my paper is on these issues. It's on understanding AI in quotes that picks up the title of the, as Stephen just said, the title of the whole webinar here of our summer school. And I used quotes because I built in a deliberate ambiguity, as did Stephen in this title, Understanding LLM Understanding. Because this can mean two things, right? On the one hand side, we can ask, do LLMs understand the meaning of the text they generate? Do they possess a semantic grounding? And that will be mainly my question, but not only, because the other question would be, how can we understand whether and what they understand? And in particular, this last question can be read as a quest for methodological reasoning here that should help us solve the grounding problem. And this is what I will mainly, or what I mainly want to do in the second part of the talk. As we all know, and as we can see from this very event, semantic grounding is a recent debate, and it's a highly controversial debate. It's funny to see and highly interesting to see how deeply divided our community is and how the experts are. We find extremes, pros and cons, which is interesting in itself and tells something in itself, I suppose. Whatever the solution to the grounding question is, and to the question whether LLMs do understand yet or not, certainly the question is more than just an academic exercise, because grounded AIs, grounded LLMs, once grounded LLMs must be assumed incomparably more powerful than semantically empty LLMs, or stochastic parrots, as some people call it, and I will come to this phrase later, certainly. Let me also make a preliminary remark here. In philosophy, as I come from philosophy of mind and philosophy of science, ways of looking at cognitive neuroscience and computational neuroscience, I mainly consider myself a philosopher of science. Let me make the remark that in philosophy of mind, it is a common distinction to distinguish two types of mental states, namely phenomenal states and representational mental states. It's a totally open debate whether these two classes, no, I guess nobody would believe that they are distinct. They certainly overlap. And then, but it's an open question whether they totally overlap or just partially overlap, or whether one can, or when one can be perhaps reduced to the other, and which way. All this is an open debate. I just pick up, but conceptually we can make this distinction, and I think it's a useful distinction. I actually also think that it's more than just a conceptual distinction. So what are they? Phenomenal states are states, mental states that have subjective experiential quality of what it's like character. So they amount to phenomenal consciousness. We can then think of creatures that lack this ability, this experiential quality, and they typically are called philosophical zombies. I want to be more specific here for reasons that become clear in a second. I want to call them phenomenal zombies those are creatures that behave like us, but lack phenomenality. Now, those are phenomenal states, or the lacking of those states. And then there are representational states. They are individuated by semantic content. For instance, thoughts are a paradigm example of representational states. Thoughts represent things, so represent circumstances, subjects, whatever. So they represent, and they are individuated by means of the content they carry. And here again, we can, at least in principle, think about the possibility that there might be creatures that lack this kind of capability. And we should then call them, in analogy to phenomenal zombies, representational zombies, or maybe even stronger, semantic zombies. Creatures that behave like us, but lack semantics, lack understanding, lack meaning. Now, I want to focus in this talk exclusively on representation, semantics, meaning, understanding this field. I do think we had this debate between when in Dave Chalmers' talk, I see no prima facie reason to directly connect semantics and the individuation of representational states and tie it to phenomenality. I know that this again is a debate, as I said, and I know that other people think otherwise. For instance, Stephen would think otherwise, as I already learned. We might come to that in a discussion, but here, for the purposes of my talk, I just focus on representational states and they are being individuated by the semantic content that they carry. Now, indeed, what I want to undertake in this talk is to present three theses. Some might say bold thesis, at least the third thesis is maybe bold to some people. I want to claim that we have recently witnessed what I call a generative turn in AI, but actually also in cognitive neuroscience, so in both fields. It's the idea that cognitive intelligent systems are essentially based on generative models. And that is, I think, a real turn in the field, because this means these systems are more than just passive or representational. They rather work in a highly active and generative mode. And I explain that, of course, want to explain that, of course. I think that's important. It's important in its own, but it's also important because it leads to directly leads to a second thesis. Generative models then provide a key to the ability of self-learning. And I think that's a very important ability, because it is this ability that provides the boost to recent AI and developments. And it might even, who knows, boost AI up to AGI. Who knows? I don't know, but it's at least this is a tremendous step, and it's an important step. It's not just some small gradual development. And then my thesis about semantic grounding will be that indeed large language models show basic evidence of semantic grounding. And I will argue that semantic grounding should be considered as not monocriterial, but multicriterial. I argue that there are three dimensions of grounding, and I call them functional grounding, social grounding, and causal grounding. And I will also argue that maybe the strongest argument is that these systems develop world models. And if that is true, then there are no semantic zombies or stochastic parrots at that. But they already understand language, if only in an elementary sense. And this latter proviso already indicates that I think of semantic grounding as it's not just an on-off affair. It's more than that. It's a gradual affair. Systems can be more or less grounded. And LLMs are not full-blown grounded, but their grounding isn't zero. Okay. Generative turn in AI. What do I have in mind here? I'm just briefly, and I think maybe it's superfluous to present this in this audience, but just a reminder for all of us. Of course, there's this old debate between symbolic and neural AI, between the idea whether cognition is rule-based symbol manipulation or cognition is feature-based learning, the connectionist idea. And as we all know, symbolic AI has been the dominant paradigm up until the 2000 years, up until 2010, 2013 maybe, the year of the ImageNet contest. And only recently, over the last decade or so, neural AI has become dominant. Connectionism has become dominant, at least, yeah, it has become dominant. But the debate, we see the debate in this webinar as well. It's the divide between researchers is to a large extent still a divide that goes back to this distinction between symbolists and connectionists. Speaking about the connectionist, I think we can, if we look at the history, we see three waves of connectionism. The early wave, the first wave, mainly driven by the pioneer of all of this, Frank Rosenblatt in the 50s and early 60s. Then came what is sometimes called the first neural winter. I mean, people talk about winters in AI history, and it depends whether you talk to a symbolic AI person or to a neural AI person, because sometimes what is winter for the one is spring or summer for the other, and vice versa. So for the connectionist, the first neural winter would be the years of certainly the 70s, where there was almost no money spent to neural network research. And then the 80s, in the 80s, we see an explosion of neural network models. We see the PDP development and all that. And then again, that kind of development and uprise declined somewhere in the 90s, mid-late 90s, and the second sort of neural winter set in. And from the 2010 years now, over the last decade, we see sort of the third wave of connectionism, sometimes called the deep learning revolution, and rightly so, by Terry Zanofsky and others. Now, speaking about a generative term, you might think of generative AI as being data producing AI. But I think the gist of it and the clue of it is something more deeper. It's not just mere data production. It marks an important turn in the field. And why is that? Under the traditional picture, indeed the traditional picture also in philosophy of mind, we have mainly focused, always and mainly focused on cognitive systems, intelligent systems as being passive receptive systems that are fed by data, that sort of extract what's out there and want to build internal representations of the external world. So we think of this, of cognitive, intelligent beings and creatures and systems as mainly working in the mode of encoders or discriminative models in the parlance of statistical or machine learning that are then good in classifying given input data, while the view of systems and creatures as the generative AI view, the recent development, would be turning this upside down and think of AI systems, neural networks in particular, as not passive but active, highly active generative models. So they aren't discriminative models, but generative models. It's important to think of them working in the decoding mode. And of course, we humans do that all the time. I mean, as I'm producing language, I do this. When I dream, I do this. And when I do mental travel, I do this. And it's amazing that we have that we very often overlook this capabilities. In machine learning, the idea of generative models, looking at neural networks in particular as generative models, goes at least back to the early work by Geoffrey Hinton on the Boltzmann and the Helmholtz machines. I combine this with two theses on what I call the generative term, that generative models are key to self-learning on one hand side, and that there's an interesting parallel between what goes on now in AI and what indeed goes on in cognitive neuroscience. Talking about the first, I mean, yeah, I think I can skip over that because most people know this, the distinction between a discriminative model and a generative model. In statistical learning, we give technical definitions to both. In the Bayesian framework, we would think of discriminative models as models that learn the conditional probability of certain hypotheses of hidden or latent variables, given certain evidence, given certain input data. So we learn this. Can you see my pointer? Yeah. This conditional probability, B of H and E, to categorize data. Whereas a generative model is connected to the task to learn a joint probability distribution, P of E and H, and thereby to learn how data were generated, and then classify and categorize them. That leads to all sorts of technical problems, as typically the marginalization of the P of E leads to a mathematically intractable problems. We have to approximate the posterior. We have some other model that's sometimes called the recognition model, and then we have to think of ways of approximating them. So if you have a measure between distributions, then you could then think of this as an optimization problem. Indeed, the Holger-Lyre divergence is very often standard being taken as such a measure, and so it's about minimizing this divergence. Just to grasp the main idea that I think is just the important idea here, I think the autoencoder is a very nice and easy to, more or less easy to grasp from its core idea, easy to grasp didactic example. It's an encoder-decoder structure with a bottleneck in between. And the task of the system would be to learn efficient codings of data, but of a particular and interesting type of data, namely in unlabeled data. Of course, there's learning from labeled data, and supervised learning from typically demands labeled data, but here the clue is that we can work with unlabeled data. So the encoder would come up with a sort of hypothesis on latent variables of essential features that he encodes, that he picks out of the data that's given to him, and he can test whether he is successful in that or whether he's on the right track by using these essential features that in the decoding mode to sample new data and then to compare the input and output and use, for instance, standard backprop to optimize the loss function. By this maneuver, the system can self-learn on amounts of unlabeled data, and that I think is very important, and can learn to extract essential features, hidden variables in the data. So as generative models learn the underlying distribution, they can generate new samples. Prominent types of generative neural networks start from, as I said, from Boltzmann machines, Helmholtz machines, and restricted Boltzmann machines, because Boltzmann machines are rather are not practical for practical. They're a cool idea, but for practical use, not really useful. Deep belief networks, then the more recent developments of GANs, of variational autoencoders, diffusion models, and autoregressive models, to which also transformers and large language models typically belong. As I said, my claim is that generative models are key to self-supervised learning. That is the idea, to learn models of unlabeled data and to learn the hidden causes, the latent variables, to use them to sample unseen data or to make inferences about unseen data. And of course, the term self-learning, self-supervised learning is now around, is now used by many people. And in their Turing-Award paper, Benjir, LeCun, and Hinton put it this way: they think of generative self-learning as a form of prediction or reconstruction, which is training to fill in the blanks by predicting masked or corrupted portions of the data. And that's a very important insight, because that's a clue to, to learn in a self-supervised fashion from unlabeled data. Stephen, do you want to interrupt me, or?
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, because it shows a hand. Okay, anyway, all right.
Oh, no, my error.
I'm sorry. And LLMs fall under this umbrella of self-supervised learning. They heavily draw on this key idea, this key feature of self-supervised learning, as they work such that you would show the beginning of sample sentences and drawn from training data, and then predict next words, and use the actual next word from the actual text as the ground truth. So generative AI, as I said, is key to self-learning. Generally, very basically, compare predictions of input data to actual data and enable self-learning on huge amounts of data. I think that is the boost to what we have seen over the last 10 years. And that might be boost to even more to come. Interestingly, there's a parallel development going on in cognitive neuroscience. So there's also a sort of generative turn in cognitive neuroscience. Carl Friston, whom we had last week in this series, and who is one of the key figures of what I would call the generative term in cognitive neuroscience, says explicitly that he owes much of these ideas, and that many would probably owe much of these ideas, from the developments in machine learning, in particular, for instance, from Geoffrey Hinton's workings. He says, for me, and I suspect many others, Geoffrey Hinton's ideas place the Bayesian brain center stage in a tangible and formal fashion. In more general terms, Bayesian formulations of problems in machine learning provided an inescapable metaphor for neurocomputations. Notions like the Helmholtz machine and the central role of generative models became a natural way of thinking about the brain. This gives what he just now says, that it became a natural way of thinking about the brain, starting in the 2000 years or something, is what we might now call the predictive processing wave in cognitive neuroscience. There's a nice paper by Marino on showing the origins of models in machine learning and how they would have been taken over by cognitive neuroscience. So it's predictive processing the predictive processing that actually is what I mean by the generative turn in the cognitive neurosciences. And we see this since the 2000 years. It goes under many headings. Some people, I prefer to call it predictive processing. Others talk of predictive coding, or Bayesian brain, or free energy principle, as Princeton would put it, or active inference. It's the idea that brains are considered multi-hierarchical prediction machines, and that the brain generates top-down predictions, that is to say, world models that it would throw onto the world, and it would take the bottom-up input and compare these models to the bottom-up input, and then it gets a prediction error, and it has just to process the prediction error. It's, again, this generative term, both in AI and cognitive neuroscience, it's much like a Copernican term, as we are living in the Kantian year, 300 years of 300th birthday of Kant. It's sort of a Copernican term in the cognitive process. The brain, or in general, cognitive systems in general, are not just passive, receptive, or representational, but active and model generating. I think that's a very important general message that we can see here. All right. So that was the first part. Now I should finally come to the real issue, semantic grounding. And as I said, I want to first make some methodological remarks and then dig into my favorite methodology. All right, here we are with animals. There are these papers of octopuses and parrots that are skeptic about the capabilities of LLMs, as we all know. The Bender and Color paper that proposes the octopus test, which is essentially a variant of Searle's Chinese room, to human speakers that, for whatever reason, have stranded on 2 desert islands, can communicate with each other via an underwater cable. And then there is this hyper-intelligent octopus who is not familiar with what goes on in the surface world. He taps into the cable, listens to the human conversation, and learns to predict the speaker's outcomes with great accuracy. That's the thought experiment. And Bender and Collar insist, no matter how accurate the prediction, the octopus will never be able to grasp the meaning of human communication and language. And LLMs are like that, they argue, and much along the same lines. The consideration by Bender and Schmitschel here under the pseudonym Schmitschel on the dangers of stochastic parrots. LLMs work on autocomplete only, on the basis of autocomplete only. They are nothing but stochastic parrots. They do word statistics, word frequencies in large textual data. These sort of arguments, if they are arguments, they are thought experiments. But if they are arguments, they are grounded on assumptions about the inner workings of LLMs being transformers. Of course, we know in general how a transformer works, but we also know that there is the problem that has been tackled by many speakers in this meeting as well, that these systems are opaque, that they are black boxes to a large extent. And so internal functional assumptions, whatever they are only partially informative. I know that Ellie Pavlik will talk about means to look under the hood of the systems, and I think it's important to do that, and it's highly informative if the better we can do that. But at the moment, there's still this worry that we don't know enough about the inner workings. And so then, and we might draw maybe wrong conclusions from it. I suppose that this is a wrong conclusion, the stochastic parrot conclusion. And so what would be an alternative to looking under the hood of the system? I come back to this point, but what would be an alternative to this? Well, of course, the simplest idea that comes to mind is to look at external behavior. So evaluate what the systems are doing from a third-person perspective. And Turing test-like methods, again, Dave Chalmers has talked about it, can be used as a behavioral criterion for machine intelligence. But as we all know, testing LLM behavior also leaves us puzzled because this can go in both ways. On the one hand side, we see these systems as showing startling and striking capabilities. On the other hand side, they make these blatant errors. They show these hallucinations, or as we should rather say, confabulations. They don't really hallucinate as they don't perceive. And we all know about the basic problems between Turing test-like behavioral methods. They are just too easy to deceive. The famous example of Ned Block of playing chess by just using a lookup table also came up in one of the talks with yesterday or the day before that by Lupian, I think. These sort of methods, looking at the behavior, they are external methods from a third-person perspective. So we can call them behavioral methods. We could also argue that they are done from a third-person perspective, we can call them extrospective. And I call them extrospective here. There is a way of doing behavioral tests, not extrospective, but using the opposite, namely introspection. That's a peculiarity of cognition, of course. Cognition as a research target. A physicist who who scrutinizes matter or the deep down nature of what an electron is cannot go along and ask the electron, hey, come on, tell me what your charge is or what the mass is or what fields do you couple to or something. But we can do that with our research targets, at least in part. We can test our research targets by means of introspection, take the inner first-person perspective of these systems, or try to reach at that. Which is to say, we can ask these systems, for instance, LLMs, to give us self-reports. Here's a silly-nilly discussion I did with ChatGPT, admittedly just version 3.5 in last November. I would have asked the following. Okay, as a language model, you generate any form of text. But do you understand these texts? Can you grasp the meaning of the texts? And it would come up with answers like that. I can generate and understand text based on patterns and information present in the data on which I was trained. I don't have understanding or consciousness in the way humans do. So here the system immediately confuses representational and phenomenal states. My responses are generated by predicting the next word or sequence of words given the input I receive. While I can generate contextually relevant and coherent responses, I lack true comprehension or awareness. I did not ask for awareness, but for the system, it would just put these in together. So I wasn't quite satisfied. I asked, wouldn't it be possible for you to develop a form of world model or world knowledge or even semantic understanding of the world through your training using large amounts of language data? And so ChatGPT was like, yeah, during my training with large amounts of text data, I have developed a certain amount of knowledge about the world and an understanding of many topics conceived in these texts. However, I have no capacity of self-reflection or thinking for myself. In a sense, you could say that I have an artificial knowledge of the world based on the available textual data, but it's not a true understanding or awareness that humans have. I guess that we all know that Stephen did a large conversation with ChatGPT, and which is far more insightful than this superficial discussion that I had with it. So I refer the audience to that. But here, what I want to draw out of this is, it's on the one hand side, it's remarkable that ChatGPT gives sort of self-reports, and it does more than just giving sort of self-reports. It also gives sort of self-explanations of why it is that it does this and that. It actually reflects on its own semantic capabilities, and in this regard, it's certainly better than the average human. I mean, ask any person on the street of why it is that his cognition works this way or that way. Typically, people don't have a clue. However, that alone doesn't make me trust in what ChatGPT answers to me here. I think we can all agree that there are still basic problems with, even with introspectively developed behavioral data, and the problems with behavioral methods in general persist even when introspection is taken into account. There are other interesting topics that crop up that have also been mentioned by some authors and speakers in this conference, that there are, when it comes to introspection issues, that there's LLMs might show hints of theory of mind capabilities. Already the Bubeck et al. Study argued that GPT-4 passes the standard design for theory of mind, the false belief test or Sally-Anna task. Terlanovsky made the remark, the observation that LLMs may just mirror the interviewer's intelligence, that they kind of run a reverse Turing test with us. But be that as it may, I still think that we should not take introspective methods as reliable tests on whatever goes on in these systems, or at least not the most reliable tests. So what I've done now, ever so briefly, is going over, really ever so briefly, over different ways of, or methods that we could use in principle. And I think rather generally and from a rather systematic perspective, there are 5 ways, 5 methods that we can generally distinguish to sort of test semantic grounding. 3 what I call extrospective methods and 2 introspective methods. The introspective ones I went over in the slides before, like the first would be self-reports and the other is self-explanations. The analog to self-reports would be reports on the overall behavior. So that's the Turing test method. That's E1, the extrospect. When it comes to extrospection, this would be the analog to self-reports as an introspective method. But then there is what we also mentioned, of course, the idea that we should look under the hood of the systems. I call this a bottom-up method. We want to understand bottom-up how the systems work and function, grasp the internal functioning, and maybe from that then finally judge whether there is semantic grounding, yes or no. This is what I call extrospective method number 3, but there's a one in the middle that I have not considered yet. And this is what I call top-down method. Take theories of semantics as they have been developed and discussed in philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, maybe linguistics, and apply them to the system and just see whether they fulfill the kind of criteria that have been theoretically developed in these theories. And that's actually the route I want to follow here. Why is that? Because I think that at least these 3 methods are not very promising. 3 is a task for researchers like, for instance, Ellie. And 2 is the kind of thing that maybe a philosopher can contribute to this enterprise. So let's do that. Semantic grounding, a tripartite way. I call it tripartite because if you look into the literature of like more than like 50, 70 years of debates on what is semantics, what is meaning, what kind of theories could we come up with, what's language after all? So debates in philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and neighboring fields, linguistics. Of course, there's a plethora of theories. Still, you can see certain family resemblances between, or you can see different groups of theories, classes of theories, and they can be classified in the way what they think is the most important criterion for grounding. And I think looking at theories of semantics this way suggests a tripartite way, 3 ways of semantic grounding, namely the sort of theories that take what I call causal grounding to be the dominant or the major topic, which is the idea that meaning mainly is reference. And there's a second group that sticks with social grounding. Social grounding is mainly the idea that meaning is used. And then there's what I like to call functional grounding. Still not quite sure whether this is the best name, but if there are any proposals for a better name, but in lack of any other term, I call it functional grounding. It's the idea that meaning is an internal functional role, a system internal functional role. And as you can see immediately, this differs from the other 2, as this is an internal characterization, whereas these would be external characterizations, which talk and think about the way how systems, creatures, beings relate to the world. So I should start, and I will start with functional grounding. I go over all 3 of them now, and I start with the last one, functional grounding. Meaning as functional role, that's the key idea here. And to use a didactic example, consider chess. I know that chess has also be used by others as an example for maybe other purposes. I know also that it will come up in Ellie's talk, probably also for other purposes. I use it here the following way. If we think of chess, what does it mean that someone understands chess? Well, it means to it's the demand to get the meanings of the different chess pieces. And what are they? What makes the knight, the rook, a rook, a bishop, a bishop? Well, it's the role that the particular piece plays in the game. It's a functional role. Of course, this role is assigned to all of the different pieces, or the types of pieces, by the rules of the game. But nevertheless, it's an internal functional role. Once I understand the internal functional role, I understand the meaning of what makes a knight in the game of chess. It's an internal, I emphasize the term internal here because ideas of reference, of relation to the external world don't come into the picture. And rightly so. Why not? Because chess is just a pure invention of the human mind. There is no reference of chess in the external world. Unlike, for instance, the meaning of the term tree, which may not, should better refer somehow to trees out there. There's no such thing for a knight or a rook. So all there is to the meaning of a particular chess piece is the functional role in the game. And if you think of what many AI systems do, generative AI systems at that, they do exactly that. They extract functional roles. They extract patterns or structures in the data from which they learn, by which they are trained, and thus record how the data internally relate to each other. Parts of the data relate to each other. Learning that and extracting that, getting insight into data on that level is what I would call functional grounding. It's much like the idea of an internal functional role semantics, that what it is to a particular word in a language, in English language, my mother tongue, in the German language, is the role that it plays in connection, in relation to all the other words in the language. And philosophers and linguists have distinguished different sorts of role theories here. If you look at it more fine-grained, people distinguish between conceptual role semantics, inferential role semantics, computational role semantics, causal role semantics, and what have you. I use functional role semantics as just an umbrella term for all of those. I don't dig into these particular differences that we can make and should make if we look at it more closely. I only want to use this core idea of meaning as an internal functional role in a data set. So that would be functional grounding. Then there is what I call social grounding. I want to call it social grounding, meaning as use. And this is basically the idea of Wittgensteinian sort of use theories of meaning. Meaning here is constituted by the use of language. And rule following is a social practice. There are no eternal written rules somewhere. It's the rule of how to apply words in our language is not only shown in our overall behavior, it's constituted by our overall behavior, our use of all of the words in our language. If you think of a system like AlphaGo, DeepMind 2016, that would play Go on a superhuman level. Does it play Go in the sense of Wittgenstein? Well, you could ask, you could say yes and no. Well, does it? Or ask more generally. Does it play Go? You could ask. You could give a twofold answer. In terms of functional grounding, yes. It certainly has sort of grasped the meanings of Go pieces. Well, there's only one sort of them, but anyway, it has understood the internal functional roles. Otherwise, it would be mysterious how the system did what it did. But it has not, if you ask it from this Wittgensteinian perspective, it doesn't play Go as it lacks social context. It has no clue what a game is, what a Go game is at that, why humans play it, maybe for fun or whatever. So it lacks the shared and public practice of playing Go. So it has a functional grounding, but no social grounding, just to understand more what social grounding is. How about LLMs then? LLMs, I claim, already show a certain sort of social grounding to the extent that LLMs have become, and maybe even further become, communicative partners in our language games. We already use them, we communicate with them, we do conversations with them. Stephen has written a large paper on a conversation like that with them. So that by doing that, we incorporate them in our language games. They become partners in our language games, and thereby they become socially grounded, starting from almost zero and gradually increasing. And so today I conclude that they already show an elementary social grounding, and that social grounding, here we can see it very good, that is grounding in general is gradual, social grounding in particular is obviously gradual. Let me come to the third and maybe for some people, the most important sort of grounding, causal grounding, the core idea that meaning is reference. Meaning through reference to the world. You might argue, and many people would argue, that LLMs have no causal grounding whatsoever. For them, therefore, they have no grounding at all. And that already, I think, is wrong if I'm right with that grounding has more than one dimension, that there's more than just causal grounding. But even if you think of causal grounding, yes, you could say there is no direct causal grounding in the classic LLMs, the non-multimodal LLMs. Multimodal LLMs, things become far more tricky, of course. But in non-modal LLMs, as they have no direct causal contact with the world, you might say there is no causal grounding. But as many have also pointed out, also in this conference, they learn from text of causally grounded speakers. So what we can say is that they show a sort of indirect causal grounding. The fact that we fully blown causally grounded creatures, provide them with our text, the text that we have come up with, and so indirectly, or that they are grounded. They have contact to the world. Certainly it's a functional grounding, and certainly the idea of functional grounding already comprises the possibility, as I said, extracting internal functional role already comprises the possibility to extract significant structure from the data. Now, as in large language data, in large corpuses of language data, the world is sort of mirrored in our language and in our texts. These systems already by their functional grounding extract a significant part of world structure. That is to say, causal regularities and other regularities of the world. So LLMs developed a directly functional grounded and indirectly causally grounded world model cycling, which are then represented in the parameters of the LLMs. There's evidence, I think, for this, although I do not think that this issue can be settled by empirical studies alone. The empirical studies might help. Of course, we must do this sort of empirical studies, as many of the people also in this webinar have contributed to. We must do these empirical studies, but at the end of the day, it cannot be judged on these empirical studies alone, unfortunately. We should not be, this is no surprise. We are, in the same sense, at a loss to judge, if we look at the animal kingdom, whether and to which extent a dog is semantically grounded or a cockroach is semantically grounded. And so here we are with LLMs, and we have all sorts of insights, and we have certain evidence for world models. And the same sort of questions. Is this sufficient for grounding already? I claim it indicates that there is at least an indirect causal grounding yet. My final considerations. Okay, so LLMs, if I'm right, develop indirectly causally grounded world models. What would amount to direct causal grounding then? Here again, I claim that gradual criteria are to be expected. And I want to finish with a little Gedankenexperiment again. Consider Papageno. He's grown up in a stimulus-poor room, and he has lacked any direct causal contact with the world. Philosophers might think a bit of the marriage scenario. It's a different thing here, but yeah.
Holger, we're here in Philistine America. You have to tell them who Papageno is.
Oh, okay. It's from, well, I noticed that you are an expert in classic music, aren't you? Because in one of
I'm a failed musician.
You're a failed musician. Oh, come on. Okay. So you know much more about Mozart than I do, I suppose. Probably.
You don't want me to describe the Zauberflöte, I hope.
Okay. Well, I don't want to talk about Mozart and Papageno in particular, and anyway, but, neither. But I used it because I thought it's nice. On the one hand side, we have the idea of stochastic parrots, and then we have this figure of Papageno in the magic flute. So as I introduce him here, he's grown up in a stimulus-poor room, no direct causal contact to the world, but he has access, and he had access and unlimited access to written and spoken media. So textual input only. So it's pretty much an analog of an LLM. No, only written media, no graphics, no pictures. So the question is Papageno a semantic zombie? Like current LLMs, he has an indirect causal grounding only. How would we go from that to a more direct causal grounding? Well, you might say, okay, provide him with sensory possibilities. Call this Papageno version 2. But what does it mean, providing him with sensory possibilities? What would be sufficient for that? Would it be sufficient to just provide him with graphics, images, video, which would be the step of multimodal models that we have now, TV? You might then say, well, still, this is not quite what I have in mind with genuine perception, because this is just a media-mediated world. And a media-mediated world isn't equivalent to direct, immediate perception, whatever that is, because the media-mediated world might be a fake. You might say Papageno version 2 then is no better off than a Putnam-style brain in a vat. Okay. So here, I leave that open at the moment. The question occurs, and we have that question now with multimodal models: what counts as direct sensory perception? I don't think that we have clear-cut criteria for that. But suppose we were at that point. So climb up to Papageno version 3. He has perceptual capabilities, but no motor access to the world. He would be no better off than a complete locked-in patient. So, and some people might say, so that still doesn't suffice for genuine grounding. What is sufficient, what is for genuine grounding is that a creature must be able to actively explore the world. So only a fully embodied being, Papageno version 4, with active motor skills. And as you can see, whatever the answers to all these questions are, and I won't give answers here, I'm just saying that here it seems that we are, again, climbing up a ladder of gradual steps, becoming more and more directly grounded. So again, the question of indirect versus direct isn't an on-off question. It's again a gradual process. And AI technology, of course, I no need to tell this to the audience here, is treating this path. Conclusion: The generative term I claimed is key to self-learning using unlabeled, by the key idea of using unlabeled big data. LLMs, I claimed, already possess an elementary semantic grounding. This grounding is gradual. The analogy to humans are we learn, we come into the world being ungrounded and then somehow gradually learn. And we might also dislearn if you think of people who suffer from dementia, start to confabulate. Grounding fades out. It's a gradual thing. And future AIs, if that is right, and it's a gradual thing, it also means that that future AIs could outperform us in grounding. Functional grounding means to come up with significant world models. Social grounding means that the systems must become partners of our language games. And I argued that LLMs are so far only shown elementary social grounding. Causal grounding so far is elementary as well and indirect, but becomes increasingly more direct by means of multimodal models and the fusion with robotics. Thank you so much.
Okay. You know from prior sessions that you can't hear the applause, so it's okay. Friedemann, because Ellie is the official discussant, I will recognize you second. I'll let Ellie start. Is that okay? Go ahead, Ellie.
All right, great. Thank you. I made a slide. I was just kind of taking notes during your talk, Holger, because I got the slides late. So I had a few thoughts that I wanted to ask about the kind of generative turn. But if that's not the direction everyone else wants to go in the discussion.
Yes, I stopped my presentation. I like that.
Yeah, feel free. So I was just taking some notes as you're talking, and I wanted to drill in more to some of the thoughts and points you were making about this kind of generative turn and some of the language around like active or self-learning. Just because it reminded me a lot of discussions that I've had recently with colleagues, kind of about where we might hit this shift from something like stochastic parrots to kind of intelligent or human-like systems. So if I was understanding correctly, you were arguing that there is this kind of generative shift, which might be kind of like the thing that is responsible from kind of what we would, the systems we had before to the ones we have now, which are possibly approaching AGI. And that this shift is really, it's kind of entangled this shift towards generative language modeling and the ability to engage in unsupervised or self-supervised learning and the ability to take advantage of large data. And so I wanted to think more about that and then ask kind of your thoughts on, if you think it's possible, if you have thoughts to kind of pinpoint which of these things is, I guess, the secret ingredient, because if we're like, the claim is somewhat large. And I think most of the people in the workshop share your sentiment that like, it's significant to have the kinds of systems we have, and we didn't have them even a couple of years ago. So something changed. And like, I think if you drill down into this kind of, the learning mechanisms and the architectures that are different now versus say in 2010 or 2015, they actually don't feel that different. And so to me, there's something that's so odd about being like, that was the difference. So for an example, if we think about something like a generative language model, right now we have a transformer model that's predicting words one at a time in a sentence. And it's a generative model in that it's generating text, but each one of those steps is really just very much just you could view it as a discriminative many-way classification. What is the next word in the sentence, right? So you could have a very similar model that just gets a sentence prefix and predicts what's the next word or what's the missing word. And actually we did have words like that, like word-to-vec type models or BERT type models they're not generative in the way GPT-4 is generative, but like mathematically feel very, 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 very similar. And so when we look at that compared to the models we have now, how much do we want to say that there is like a qualitative, meaningful shift in the kind of AI we're dealing with when we switch to kind of standard language modeling compared to something like word-to-vec or BERT, that such that the latter will give us AGI and the former wouldn't? Or is it actually just a matter of scale and we're dealing with the same kind of thing? The similar, and I think you got at this a bit with the Papageno experiments, is when we talk about the LLMs being active, because I've gotten into this debate and I don't actually know where I fall, so I want to hear your thoughts on this. But when I talk to colleagues who study reinforcement learning, for example, or who really believe in the need for embodied agents, they would really argue that these LLMs are definitely not active, and arguably not even really unsupervised, right? Like what we have is a very large amount of data that we didn't have to label manually, but the models are still making a prediction, being told a right answer. That's the right answer. They update based on the answer they saw, and they move on to the next step, right? So it's very different from like the kind of curiosity-driven exploration that you might see a child do. And so there is a connection to predictive learning, predictive coding from neuroscience, but there's a ton of other stuff that neuroscientists believe humans do that when I talk to neuroscience colleagues or robotics colleagues, they're like, yeah, don't give LLMs that much credit. What you really have is what is basically supervised learning, right? And this really comes in when, we've done some work on using the LLM type architecture to do sequence modeling for example, games like chess or Go or things that we would traditionally train with RL. And people who work with reinforcement learning will say that that doesn't count because this is really a big offline, essentially a supervised learning, and it's a whole different game. And so if like we're thinking about these kinds of things and you're like, okay, what is different between the AI we have now that we're claiming is approaching AGI and the models we had, say, even in 2018, 2019, right? Which were very, very advanced compared to what was there before, but weren't getting claims of AGI. And those differences feel really small potatoes. It's like, oh, the problem was, it's basically the same as word2vec, but you just have to chain many of these predictions together or something. So I'm wondering what you think about kind of the qualitative, meaningful difference kind of in the learning mechanism or in the setup, like if you think there's something there, or if it's really just entangled with scale and what we're really dealing with is scale. And that's kind of the secret sauce for what we're getting. And yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts in this area.
Thanks so much. So two big questions that you had, two main questions, I take it. First is whether these systems from 2019 or something, or word2vec systems, BERT already, whether they are generative or discriminative, and whether there's really such a qualitative categorical step from the one to the other. Actually, in part, I would think I'm not the expert to answer this. You are the expert to answer this. And if you tell me this is just a gradual difference, I have to accept that. But I would insist from a conceptual perspective that it makes a whole lot of difference whether we think of cognitive systems in general as being just passively sitting there and being and receiving data and doing nothing but just receiving and then trying to cope with them, or whether we are in a somehow active mode. And to generate data is a somehow active mode, if only, yeah, well, it is, I insist it is a change, it is a crucial change and shift in the picture. We now think of systems as generating data rather than just eating them, being fed with them. And which is, again, I use this turn, this notion of the Copernican turn. It's maybe as big as the insight that we no longer believe in, but that was once a big insight by Kant to, change the perspective and to say that we're not only, it's not only the perspective of the empiricist, it's not the perspective of the rationalist either, but there's also, we have a priori forms of cognition that we apply to the world. And in that respect, it's not just from the outside in, there is this other arrow from the inside out. And something similar like that, I see in the recent developments. And from that perspective, I'm astounded, surprised about myself, that about everybody, that we seem to have overlooked something very obvious, that of course, cognitive systems are constantly in a highly active and generative mode. Much of what goes on, what makes cognition is to generate data, as it were. And that has always been, brushed under the carpet, or has not, it's as if this is something, okay, we can look at this later. But maybe it's wrong to think of it this time. Maybe this is important from the beginning. And this, I think, is sort of a message of the recent developments. And I think it's a big message. And it's also interesting that this message now seem to play a role in AI on the one hand side, where we have the development of generative AI, and on the other hand side, that we have this predictive processing development in cognitive neuroscience, which is at least from a high-level conceptual point of view, similar to that. There's in both of these movements, we have a turn of the perspective, right? Again, from the outside in, we go from the inside out. We have to predict things, and that's the important thing in predictive processing. And now we have to generate data, and thereby, if we do that, we can provide systems with the ability to self-learn. And we can then give them huge amounts of data we were not able to give them before. So the sky's the limit now, because we can just use any data that we have, because they need not be labeled any longer, and they can self-learn. And now that was your second question, whether isn't that still a sort of supervised learning? And yeah, that's why I think the term self-supervised is a good term here. It indicates that it's something in between the two extremes of supervised and unsupervised, right? It's self-supervised. So many people have put it this way, that they said, I think LeCun made this remark, that unsupervised is a misnomer. There is no unsupervised learning. There's always some sort of supervision going on. But the crucial thing is whether the system can do it or the creature can do it on its own, or whether it needs a teacher, an external advisor, supervisor, teacher, whatever. And to do it on your own, I think, is a crucial qualitative step. Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so I'm interested that, I actually think the non-technical intuition about whether the models we have now and the kind of training they're undergoing, the kind of learning they're doing, feels qualitatively different than before is interesting, even more so than whether we think mathematically it's deeply different. I don't know if Melanie Mitchell or Josh Tannenbaum are still around today. These are, because I think I know a lot of people who would feel like what the models are currently doing really doesn't count as the kinds of words you're using, right? So when you think about something like a self-learning, and again, you watch a child playing, and it's the child initiates a situation, creates, so the physics of the world provides supervision or something. But there's and there is feedback, right? There is definitely predictive learning. But it's they have generated a hypothesis or a theory and set up an experiment and run it and test it. And the language models really aren't capable of doing that, right? They get the text that is written. And so yeah, they do it by themselves, but only because it happens to be the case that humans wrote all this text for them, right? So it's we call it self-supervised because it was cheap for us to collect to train the model compared to labeling data, but not because it's not actually profoundly different in terms of the type of data.
Yeah, I totally agree. And making the systems embodied and providing them with a skill to actively explore the world will certainly be a crucial further step to do. In the parlance of predictive processing, people distinguish between two types of how the prediction error can be processed. So what can we do with a prediction error? There are two ways of doing it. You can use perceptual inference, or you can do what Carl Friston and company call active inference, right? Active inference is only possible if you have an embodied agent. So, and it's roughly the idea either in perceptual inference, the old Helmholtzian idea, you use the prediction error to update your internal model, your world model. Right, that would be one way. But the other way would be to say, leave your world model as it is and try to change the state of the world as much as possible in order to minimize your prediction error.
Yeah.
That's another way of doing it. That's of course a cool way, and that's of course a way that is only open to an embodied system.
Yeah.
And if and no, I don't doubt that this would be a further important step to do with AIs. Certainly. I'm just saying that the step that we have done already is already an interesting categorical qualitative step. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and to be clear, I don't even think I disagree with you. I'm kind of channeling an argument I've had where I've been on the other side and arguing kind of your position, because I think it's interesting if you're like, I don't know where I personally fall, but I think it's kind of like where people, like there are people who have argued that the kind of predictive modeling that the language models currently do cannot possibly be enough, right? And that you need this other stuff. And the current success of them is really challenging that position, right? Because it would seem like how you couldn't possibly get all of this kind of grounding and stuff just from reading text. Like that's a really common thing. And yet it seems like they do. And so it feels like it matters kind of for the argument for philosophy, whether we consider the thing that they're doing to be more than, and I think Gary was using this, more than like just next word prediction. Like basically, is this merely next word prediction, or is it something profoundly different, which is generation? I don't know. This is like maybe just now getting into the semantics of what we're calling the things, but it was really interesting because I think you were the first one I heard who was excited about this as a deeply different task. It was a new perspective I heard, so I think that was really interesting. But I see a lot of other questions in the chat, and I don't want to monopolize, so I'll.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Really cool talk.
There's also a queue in the here in the group. Friedemann, it's your turn. Please turn on your face. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me at all?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Hello, a German colleague. I already realized that you are a thorough participant of this meeting over the 2 weeks.
Right.
I have to apologize that I could only look at many of the videos, but I could not attend it as I had to teach and everything.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and exciting talk. While you talked, I sometimes thought of this very famous and very old idea of having a person in the Chinese room and having conversations through just through a verbal channel, and having this person engage in various communication.
Yeah.
And they could actually be in a very similar position as ChatGPT is, and the output could also look quite similar, isn't it? Now, my question to you, would you assume that even this person in the Chinese room would have a degree of indirect grounding, as you phrased it?
Ah. I mean, Stephen, our dear host, is of course the one who is famous for arguing that the gist, or that's how I understood your famous 1990 paper, Stephen, that you are adding to the whole Chinese room consideration, the remark and the idea that we can learn, the upshot from all of this is that causal grounding counts. And if there's no causal grounding, then there's no grounding whatsoever. And this seems to be what Friedemann is pushing now as well. And as you can see, as you can saw from my presentation, I think there's a middle ground here. We can have grounding happens on many levels. It's not just one monocriterial. And there's more to grounding than just causal grounding. And in particular, if we can see that the system picks up by means of functional grounding, picks up structures of the external world that is given to the system, even if only by textual data, then it has some sort of functional grounding, and thereby also maybe sort of indirect causal grounding. And yes, I suppose then I have to say that if this would be fulfilled in the Chinese room scenario, then I had to say that maybe the Chinese room in total, I have to give the sort of systems reply, reply to the Chinese room setting, that maybe this Chinese room, the Chinese room in total is also indirectly grounded and functionally grounded. But you know, there's other connotations to it, because the setting of the Chinese room scenario is a bit different to what we have here. And and Searle wanted to mimic a Turing machine, and he wanted to tell us that the writing head in the Turing machine itself will never grasp the meaning of the syntactically manipulated tokens, and I would agree to that. And so I should be cautious
sorry, but this is
easily
exactly
say yes to you, because you know
this is exactly the question we have now with GPT. Exactly the same. Is it just a syntactic algorithm? And you now introduce this this term of indirect grounding, which is kind of reminiscent of what Stephen defined as indirect grounding. However, in Stephen's hands, indirect grounding presupposes and assumes and is built on direct grounding of at least a subset of the vocabulary. And this we cannot claim for an artificial syntactic algorithm or network. So I have not understood what you mean by indirect grounding now
when I said indirect causal grounding and when I said functional grounding, I had in mind the idea that the system is able to extract from the data patterns and structures. And in the case of language models, I think what we can see from many studies, including studies from Ellie and others, that these systems extract from the language data, from these huge amounts of language data, structure that are isomorphic or partially isomorphic or homeomorphic to causal structures and regularities of the world. So I'm not talking about syntax here. I'm talking about causal world structure. And it's because of that that I come up with the idea of an indirect causal grounding. So that is, typically this is not the issue in debates about the Chinese room argument.
Well,
I think that Friedemann was completely right and completely on the spot. But I don't have a vote, so I will pass it on to the other speakers. I mean the other people who are asking questions now, because we're running out of time.
Okay.
You can already ask your question, Julia, because I've raised your status. But in the interest of time, the others should. I ask the speaker, actually, Holger, to look at the comments and then answer those that he sees fit to answer. But go ahead,
okay,
Julia.
Thanks. So I was wondering, when we talk about ungrounded semantic knowledge, what would that be? Because it seems like anything we can know or think would also be semantically grounded. So I'm like trying to imagine what we mean when we say that. And then like related to what Professor Pulvermuller was just saying, if you could show a non-trivial difference between words that are highly iconic for people in an LLM and otherwise comparable words, do you think that would demonstrate some level of some sort of grounding in the LLM?
What do you, like, for instance, what do you have in mind? You have an example for me?
For the second question,
Yeah.
like onomatopoeic words, like words that we think for us incorporate more reflection of our sensory experience than the average word.
I'm not sure about that. I have to think about that. Okay, maybe I start with the first question. Is ungrounded semantic knowledge possible? Huh. So, well, why shouldn't it? I mean, I said that grounding is a gradual affair. It's and for all practical purposes, I would consider a newborn semantically ungrounded. A human newborn is a semantically ungrounded creature. Well, maybe it has already learned things. Yes, sure. Before birth, yes. But,
Yeah, I think like Professor Gervain's talk, I'm sorry, I don't exactly know how to say her name, but I think her research demonstrates they do have some grounding.
all right, okay. But then it's not grounding due to language, right? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean it is.
It is due to language?
Yeah, so in her talk, she talked about how the maternal body can act as a low pass filter through which you get
Wow.
prosodic information, but not specifics of the
Oh,
higher
okay.
aspects of performance.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. I missed that. Interesting. Wow. But even then, I mean, the kind of consideration we are running in is here, of course, okay, maybe it approximates to zero or something. And I don't want to talk about the difference between being almost zero or practically zero or zero. We would certainly, don't we agree that at a certain point, the level of grounding, even in the maternal body, is zero for all practical purposes. It must have started somewhere, and it must have come from nowhere, right? It must have started with practically zero, and then it raises, isn't it? I mean, you would not think that it starts at some already immediately at some level, or do you? That would be mysterious, isn't it? I mean, it's a physical entity that gets provided with more and more semantic capabilities. That I think is a natural view here, isn't it? And I myself, I find it also interesting to look at the other end of the spectrum. Like my mother, for instance, suffers from dementia now, and I can literally, when I visit her, I can literally see how it is to see a person that kind of fades out, that starts to confabulate, being disoriented and everything, and literally loses grounding. You can literally see it and feel it, and so yes, I think that gives me. That's why I'm pretty convinced that that's a right picture to think of this as a gradual affair that comes into the world and that might fade out at a certain point, and that thereby might be different in different creatures.
Can you read the list of comments yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And pick the one. There's only 2 minutes left. Pick the ones that you want to address. And there's no panel at the end today, so it's this.
I see. Synchronization. Why should that be with functional grounding? I don't see the relation, but when generative models create data, doesn't it lead to a feedback loop and problems with overfitting? It's my understanding that AI wish to exclude AI-generated images from training data. Yes, they do now. Yeah, that leads to feedback loops. If you use generated data to then self-train, to do self-learning on that, that of course leads to a feedback loop, or leads to circularity. But that's not what I had in mind. I mean, it's interesting that we are now running out of data. Yes, that's an entirely different topic and problem, and I hope does not affect what I said about self-learning. Oh, Anna, hi, Anna Strasser. That's a question that AI could sign perhaps to discriminate. primarily due to information in vast training data, not the architecture.
I'll upgrade her so that she can say it for herself because it's probably
Yeah.
1 second. Anna, go ahead.
The question what we can learn about the data themselves and what we can learn about the architecture is, I think, a thing that might come up in Ellie's talk as well. At least I saw it in our paper. But yeah, hi, Anna.
Hey, good to see you. Thanks for the talk. That was interesting.
Thanks.
So my problem is always with all the discussion about the transformer that the people tend not to distinguish between the pure transformer and the hybrid models we have now. And so if you're talking about the pure transformer and do the nice thing, looking at all the semantic theories, I would object that maybe the self-attention mechanism, which is just one method, how it learns,
Yes.
is not enough to scale up to get further and further. And one problem is that we are already at the point that we are self-polluting the training data we
Yeah.
can feed machines. But looking at the hybrid models, and that's my question, where you have reinforcement learning, but you also have, like in Claude, constrained, maybe even symbolic AI mixed in the models. How would you then explain whether they have a little bit of semantic grounding or more semantic grounding?
Huh. You know, I have mixed feelings about hybrid models. As I'm a staunch connectionist, I think I am. I want to see architectures that arise from the bottom up, and to just plug in high-level modeling without, I mean, as if this falls from heaven, doesn't really satisfy me. So that's always the problem I have with the hybrid models. I can see that this is interesting technically, and if they do fun things and interesting things, then of course, for practical purposes, use them. I mean, people will use them and so on and so forth. But from a foundational perspective, I want to understand how the brain has developed and has evolved. And I was never convinced by the Chomskyan school that we have to just live with the idea that there is a wherever it comes from, deep down module that provides grammar and this sort of structure. And so it is with hybrid models. We plug in certain architectural structures and ideas and biases that might be, but at the end of the day, I want to understand how they evolve from the bottom.
Time is out, and this is the absolute last question, Jan. It has to be short, and the answer has to be short.
Oh, hi.
Okay, thank you. We heard earlier, and we can see in ChatGPT that it has learned the grammar from kind of self-supervised data only. But now when we have gradual grounding, in the other extreme end, we have robot that is able to manipulate the world and so forth. So in that end, I think there might be less data needed for the same kind of learning to happen. But the problem, how could we assess the kind of the middle ground between here, that not to require huge amount of data as with ChatGPT, but also not to need to build kind of perfect robots that can acquire and learn.
Okay,
Learn with less
question is
amount of
asked.
data.
Okay, why shouldn't we do that, Janne? I mean, I would think that this is the way to go. Of course, we should embody these systems and give them motor skills and everything. Why shouldn't we do that? That's the way to go.
I would like to understand how to kind of assess the
area in between.
the need the area in between and choose the right kind of area in between.
As
position
Fermat said with his famous theorem, there's unfortunately not the space or time to answer your question here now.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you
That
very
saves me.
much, Holger. Again, silent applause will be.
Thank you all.